welcome to History After All. We have a very special guest today here. K.A. Jacobson is here with us. K.A. and I are currently in the process of graduating from, we haven't quite graduated from officially our master's program in war studies, but we are in the process of graduating. K.A. is here to talk about private military companies. K.A. was very kind when I asked the group if anybody had done any work on PMCs, because I wanted to do a video on PMCs. I don't think a lot of Turkish viewers will be very familiar with the concept. They do at least have some familiarity with the concept itself. They do realize that such a thing like a private military company exists somewhere, but I'm not sure a lot of people in Turkey are familiar with how they function, how they developed through history, and how they function today, and who the major players are today in the industry. So I'm hoping this video will be a great introduction for me personally and for everybody who watches the video into what private military companies mean, what defines them, and how they function. And we will also be touching upon, I will be asking Kia her opinions on if private military companies pose any threat to human rights, because they are inherently they mean the privatization or the corporatization of the monopoly on violence, which you would typically expect the state would retain its monopoly. So, Kay, welcome. How are you? Many thanks for being here with us. This is very exciting for me. How are you? How is Berlin?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm good. Berlin is great. I am really excited to be here today, where I feel like PMCs are a kind of niche topic, especially because they're a more modern phenomenon. So they're very context specific. So it makes sense that I feel like if you have an awareness of them, it's because you are directly related to the environment or just are very aware of more recent conflicts.
So let's begin. Can I begin with a very broad question, with a very general question? What defines a private military company? What is a private military company? Do the mall cops that we see, or the mall security that we see, or in Turkey, we have a lot of gated communities and they are secured by or protected by private security. Could we define them as private military companies? What differentiates PMCs from other kind of security corporations, or what is a private army really?
So those two things are related, but they are different, where the privatization of military comes hand in hand with security. However, the fundamental difference is military versus security, where it is the idea of state armed forces. That is what private military companies relate to. So essentially, they are defined as corporations that provide military services to support armed forces for material gain, where this makes them distinct from private security companies, because typically private security companies, their realm is domestic. Private military companies, they could be used domestically, but their function is in combat. Not necessarily directly involved in combat, but they could be there in a supportive capacity. There is some overlap between PMCs and private security companies, so there's not necessarily a distinct category for both.
So we are aware, not least because we did a master's program in war studies, that warfare was conducted by private actors from the ancient times to modern times. There was a sector of warfare that was privatized, or at least private actors were a part of warfare inherently. But what differentiates today's PMCs from the mercenaries of old? Could we draw a direct parallel between mercenaries as we know from a historic sense to PMCs of today?
There does seem to be some tension, I believe, in the academic community over whether to directly label PMCs mercenaries or vice versa. But when it comes to PMCs, the distinctive trait that you use to define them is a corporate entity, where that is heavily tied to capitalism, and their development and proliferation is directly tied to the Cold War. So in terms of mercenaries, probably at the core of the definition is material gain, whereas you will always have people who are looking for adventure or to pillage or to just because they take pleasure in the violence. With PMCs, it's a bit more complicated. Obviously, there is profit involved in the violence, if they are partaking in direct combat activities, but the difference is the corporate entity, and that organization is very prescribes certain limits on their behavior and does dictate a certain kind of behavior in terms of the fact that they are profit driven.
So how did the concept of PMCs, is the term correct? Because I have read some people refer to them as PMFs, private military firms. It's the same thing, I guess. Is there really a debate on what a PMC is, or is everybody sure of what a PMC means? Are you aware of any legal debates over what a PMC is or what it should be? Are we just as a housekeeping question?
So there is ambiguity when it comes to defining PMCs, particularly under international law, with the attribution of responsibility in combat, where they are a corporation, they are a legal entity with an economic function, but at the same time, they are involved in military activities. So it becomes extremely complicated. Also, if you consider activities on the battlefield and in war zones, it's hard to find certain transparency and identify behaviors. Also, when certain behaviors like war crimes come out, it's difficult to attribute responsibility. Where are you going to put it on essentially the CEO as the primary stakeholder, or are you going to go back to the host country, or sorry, the country of origin, or actually the employer? And then in terms of on the ground operations, are you similar to actual military engagements? Is it going to come down to the soldiers on the ground or the leaders?
So how did the concept develop through history? When did the first PMC emerge? Are you aware of who the first PMC was?
So with the Cold War, with the end of the Cold War, that's when PMCs really developed. Where I believe maybe the first one, I can't quite remember the name, but would have been linked to the 1960s, where over time, as the Cold War is winding down, you have massive demobilization of military, where you have a massive surplus of both arms and soldiers, where you have people with combat experience who, well, now they have to find a new living. And PMCs do represent a solution to that, where in order to, I guess, deal with the surplus of soldiers with combat experience, you have to have demobilization and reintegration. And that is not always possible. So in terms of the Cold War, it was probably 1980s when the first probably modern PMC developed executive outcomes, where it's actually South African in origin, not American. And that is largely held to have set the model for PMCs since.
What does a PMC do? Or what did the ones in the 1980s do? What were their missions? In what scale did they work?
So this is where it gets a bit complicated, where in terms of PMCs, there are different categories where you have the idea that they're directly engaging in offensive operations. And oftentimes it is hard to differentiate between offensive and defensive, but you do have them partaking in actual on the ground operations. But you also have them serving in supportive functions, where sometimes they help with intelligence and information gathering. Other times they just help with training. So oftentimes PMCs might not necessarily fit into one category. They provide a range of services.
With the 1980s or the end of the Cold War, we have the first modern PMCs. And what would you say the historical turning points were in the development of PMCs? And were they really or directly linked to major conflicts? Did they really flourish where conflicts took place all over the world? How did they really develop through the last 4 decades, 4 or 5 decades?
So in terms of the first major PMC executive outcomes, they were involved in conflicts in Africa, particularly the Congo and Angola. And what was unique about them was that they were staffed, I think, primarily from the South African military, whereas alongside apartheid, you had a lot of people who were discharged and who had a lot of combat experience but didn't have, I guess, professional opportunities, where the purpose of the leader in forming the company was to form a professional military corps, where it was very different from, I guess, a more historical association of mercenaries as fortune seekers. This was directly aimed at being professional and being a corporation. And in terms of their effect, they were noted for their high proficiency and high organization, particularly when it comes to Angola, where they displayed the capabilities of being able to field what was essentially a professional standing army, which was much more than was expected for a PMC. I may be mistaken in that it was not Angola where the battle I'm referring to took place. It was in the Sierra Leone conflict, where that was against the insurgent forces.
When was this? 1980s, 1990s?
The Sierra Leone, that would have been 1990s, later 1990s, because I believe the Sierra Leone government had employed a previous PMC that was overwhelmed, and then they then employed executive outcomes.
Could we draw a parallel between the end of the First World War, where the paramilitaries really came to the forefront in Europe, in the Balkans, in some instances or in some contexts, Turkey, and the end of the Cold War, when you have the surplus of soldiers and the change in the warfare that is conducted, and the societal change and the economical change. I'm excluding World War II because I do believe it's a different story, but would that be it doesn't have to be a academically accurate parallel, but do you see where I'm coming from?
Yes, I do. I'm not quite sure about causation, but there definitely are parallels, particularly when it comes to paramilitaries, where for paramilitaries themselves, the issues with demobilization and reintegration, that is also linked to the proliferation of organized crime, particularly following the 1990s and the Yugoslav wars. So I would say that there are very distinct similarities between that and PMCs that are deserving of further study.
So would it be a correct observation that war harms people even when it ends? It's a difficult process. It's difficult to start, it's difficult to end, and even its end doesn't necessarily bring peace for all or eternal peace in any way.
I feel like that does come down to a debate about what the ending of a war means, where you can have the cessation of violence, but does that mean people are willing to go back to the idea that violence is the realm of the state and not that they have to turn to themselves for security? And also, it comes down to whether they feel they've been wronged and whether they feel that they have had justice.
And what made me think of the parallel is every major conflict, let's say for the past 100 years, we saw three major conflicts, the World War One, World War Two, and the Cold War. Let's say, let's keep it in the same category as the other two. And at the end of each one, we saw considerable, substantial societal change, economical change. And the First World War brought about as we say, the paramilitaries and the changes in borders, whatnot. And the end of the Cold War brought about a global level societal change. What would you say really triggered the emergence of modern day PMCs? Would it because for a non-expert observer, the end of the Cold War is, in a very simplistic way to put it, it was a victory for the Americans. And a PMC, while not invented by the Americans, seems like an American invention. It is very in line with the American corporate spirit, or a non-expert observer could believe so, or could develop such an opinion. What makes PMCs directly linked to the end of the Cold War? What factors do you think triggered their emergence?
Well, this is rather simplistic, but capitalism, in that you have a significant surplus of weapons that are widely available. You have the people with the expertise to take that surplus and monetize it. I think in some ways it's a very logical, I guess, continuation, in that if that is what you know, and you have already, I guess, had a significant amount of combat experience, it's what you know, and you're able to monetize it. Of course, you have the incentive to go into that. And then in terms of, I guess, other factors, you have the emergence of, I guess, the governments are outsourcing more and more functions, where it wasn't just the military. There was a precursor to that in other sectors of society. But military adds to that.
Also, the end of the Cold War brought about some changes in the scale of warfare, or that's what we believed up until 2022, or maybe in some ways still. We saw the rise of smaller wars, guerrilla wars, regular warfare in a lot of regions. Would you say the rise of PMCs also correlates with that?
Yes, they are, where the other aspect is that as the Cold War winds down, superpowers are less inclined to intervene, where they're not willing to bear the costs, either militarily or politically, with blowback in their publics. So PMCs represent their power lies in plausible deniability, where they represent the possibility of implementing a certain outcome in foreign affairs, while maintaining distance and restricting the costs you bear. So in terms of PMCs, I believe there has been direct like citations of the fact that in I don't like this term, the so-called developing world, with conflicts erupting and superpowers less inclined to intervene, PMCs represented an opportunity for states with very weak militaries to fill that void.
So, how does a PMC function? If you work for a PMC, what would your mission be? What kind of
Me personally,
that's a great question. Would you personally, as a person, would you personally be interested in doing some work for the PMCs? Do you think it's a one lucrative or interesting area of work? But other than that, from a grander scale, what would a person do for a PMC? What would their mission entail? What kind of missions would they be entrusted with?
well, for many PMCs, particularly for former combatants, it represents the opportunity to monetize their experience. But on the other hand, you also have, with increasing technological proficiency, the ability of people to affect things like combat operations is immense now, where you don't necessarily need to have served in active combat. You need to have intelligence and technological skills. So this does present valuable professional opportunities for people like that. In terms of the ethical implications, I would argue that there are ethical implications regardless. It doesn't matter whether you're on the ground, you are having a distinct effect on the violence unfolding, whether you're supporting in a logistical capacity or directly.
So let's imagine we can also draw upon the historical examples. Let's imagine there's a conflict somewhere, and a PMC is tasked with deploying there. What kind of stuff do they do? Imagine someone not familiar with PMCs, and if they're watching this video, they might imagine just a group of people armed to the teeth going anywhere in the world and just starting blasting their rifles. Is that what a PMC does? What kind of missions do they do? What kind of intel? You said intelligence. You said on the ground combat. What other kinds of things they might be entrusted with?
It's not necessarily combat operations. A lot depends on the function they've been hired to fulfill. For some hirees, it is about training, and for some, it is about advising. So there is a wide range of functions that they can fulfill related to military and security. In some instances, they have been directly used to, I guess, secure lucrative opportunities related to oil and diamond mines. So their function is very versatile. It depends on the aims of the employers and also the tactics that employers are willing to sanction in order to achieve that.
How many people make up a PMC generally? Because we keep saying private armies, but they're not in scale. They're not really armies, are they? They're much smaller
No.
in scale.
So the scale varies. Part of the issue is that it's difficult to collect that kind of statistical information, whereas they are corporate entities, so in certain instances you could make a guess. In terms of averages, I'm not sure. I think it's something that should be studied, but I don't believe that information is widely available. It honestly depends, I think, on the intention of the corporation's functions, whether they're intending to, I guess, focus on a more logistical role or supportive capacity, or whether they intend to take part in an offensive capacity. A lot depends on both the employer and the company itself.
So it's not just a regular standing army, but private. It's a whole different way of
Yes.
functioning.
So it's not a standing army at all. Comparable to, I guess, conventional militaries, the idea is that you have people on call, where there's not the maintenance of barracks. You have people that you contact for specific missions, where it's much more fluid than the idea of a typical army that we might think of. But within that, you also have a level of specialization that modern armies don't have, where it's a niche group of, I guess, essentially elite people that you can call upon. So theoretically, their proficiency and effectiveness should be much higher.
Back to the historical narrative. For those unfamiliar with the topic, what differentiates mercenaries from PMCs is it just the scale and complexity of how PMCs function, or is it the also mission types, or is there a problem with the definition? Could a mercenary still be working for a PMC? Could you be called a mercenary if you are working for a PMC? It's not just a group of mercenaries, is it?
No, I think it's very complicated, and there does seem to be some tension within academia over labeling, where there's an uncertainty of who is what and whether those two are exclusive to one another. It's very fluid, where I think, well, mercenaries are actually the category that is prohibited under the UN and international law. PMCs are much more complicated. I think largely it's the corporate aspect to it that is the defining factor and also serves as the distinctive feature between that and mercenaries. Where mercenaries, the common association is sword for hire, or maybe in this case, gun for hire. PMCs have that aspect, but they're also different.
What kind of license would anybody need to have to become a member or a worker or a combatant for a PMC? Do PMCs, as far as you're aware, do PMCs hold their own qualification processes? What qualifies someone for working for a PMC? If you're just great at shooting people, if you're just great at something, would that automatically qualify you to work for a PMC?
Well, similar to any other job, they would want relevant experience and at least transferable skills. So, not necessarily proficiency in firearms, but combat experience. They would also have to have psyche valves just for liability. Alongside that, they would also want certain technological experience if you haven't necessarily served in the military. So, part of it does come down to what relevant skill set and background do you have? And also, likely, why are you doing this? Where, as a corporation, you don't want a sociopath on the ground who's going to go rogue. You want someone who, actually similar to a modern military, who will listen to orders and can be held accountable.
But at the end of the day, it's the corporations that decide to employ people, right? The states that, let's imagine a state is employing a PMC or hiring a PMC or tasking a PMC with something. And PMC is employing its own people. At the end of the day, it's the PMC who decides. And do you think typically a state hiring a PMC would vet its workers? So at the end of the day, as a state, you are guiding a fighting force or a combatant or non-combatant force into a region, and you have no idea who you're sending. Is that correct? Is that a correct assumption?
It depends on the nature of the state. Because as you've pointed out with the Turkish example, that PMC has very close ties with the government. So it depends whether the PMC is directly, I guess, subordinate to the government, even if it's informal, or whether it maintains more autonomy. So theoretically, PMCs would be responsible for the vetting of their employees. That is the benefit to governments in hiring them. It's a plausible deniability where if something goes wrong on the ground, they are able to blame the PMC.
Is that why states use PMCs for deniability? Or is it one of the primary reasons?
It is one of the primary reasons, where the other part is just financial costs. They don't want to pay for that level of a force, and it's an easy way to outsource both the financial costs and the political costs, where increasingly worldwide, publics are more resistant to the idea of their state forces being involved in external fights.
If people are increasingly reluctant to see their armed forces in foreign fights or fights abroad, assumedly, people are also reluctant in joining their own armies. Who are these people leaving the fighting to? Would that make the employee base or hiree base for the PMCs potentially more dangerous? People who are more with more bloodlust, for lack of a better term?
I don't like to just repeat this, but it is complicated, where you do have people who cite pride in serving their nation, even if they're in a PMC, where patriotism does factor in. Whereas compared to mercenaries, PMCs, their employees have more of a diversity of motivations, where it's not necessarily bloodlust. Financial has to factor in because it is a job, but it's not necessarily the only one. Also, in terms of the Turkish context, ideology does matter.
Yeah, let's move more towards the modern time period. Are you aware of roughly how many PMCs there are operating, or how many at least major PMCs are operating currently in war zones? Or are we aware of any instances of PMCs being very effective or being the defining factor in the outcome of a battle or a combat in a war zone?
So actually, a lot of the more prominent PMCs are from the West, the US, the UK, and also Israel. But I would say that probably the most prominent example right now is the Wagner Group, whereas in the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine and the 2014 annexation of Crimea, they were very active and they have been a distinctive part of combat operations, where they have been involved in some very heavy fighting, particularly with Bakhmut. So I would say probably the Wagner Group is the most prominent example. It's also going to likely set a precedent due to its prominence, where not just due to state ties, but also due to conduct.
Just out of curiosity, without any ideological bias at all, if you use Wagner as a precedent, or if you use Wagner as an example of a PMC that is potentially more malign in its conduct, would that also, in a way, protect the Western PMCs?
It could, in that it does set like a pretty high contrast, as in you can market your firm as, well, we're not them, we pay attention to human rights, and we are more accountable. At the same time, though, when it comes to Wagner, their involvement in other conflicts, particularly on the African continent, has come alongside other PMCs being involved in opposition to them. So in some ways, PMCs, their usage doesn't take place in a vacuum. They're not just a proxy, they invite response by an opposing side or opposing interest.
Could we focus a bit more on Wagner? What are they really? How close are they with the Russian state? What differentiates Wagner from the more better known or traditionally better known American PMCs like Blackwater?
Unfortunately, this is not necessarily my area of expertise, but when it comes to Wagner, I would say the scale of their involvement is key. Also, even if America does have PMCs, we are technically still a democracy, and that does create a key difference. Where the level of control that Putin exercises, even if the leader, unfortunately, I cannot pronounce his last name properly, with the, I believe it was 2023 rebellion, he was able to do that, but not really. And that 2 months later, he was killed. And now I believe his son has taken over the company and is continuing Wagner operations as usual in Ukraine.
Aside from Wagner, let's say this is the definitive example of what a PMC could potentially become. What other major actors do we have still on the field today? And what would you say after the Iraq War in 2002, 3, 4? Which companies defined what a PMC was for past 2 decades? Do we have any such examples?
We have Blackwater as a very prominent example with the Iraq War. And then we also have the reestablishment of executive outcomes in the past year or so. But also there's debate over whether they were ever fully not active, and that there is argument that more subsidiaries continue to function alongside executive outcomes original model. It was just under a new name, like Sandline. And then you also have Blackwater being renamed Constellus. I think that's it.
Is it currently called Academy or
In
Academy?
2013, no, Academy was one of the companies that merged to form its current iteration, Constellus Holdings.
We have those, and we have Wagner. Wagner's difference is in scale and its ties to its. When I say its state or its country, I tend to, as a historian, I tend to think of PMCs as belonging to certain countries, but that's completely opposite of the idea. I'm completely getting the idea wrong in doing this, aren't I?
Well, not necessarily. It's the problem with theory versus reality, where in theory they should be autonomous, but in practice they aren't. Whereas if you are a more corrupt government, it makes sense to outsource, well, somewhat, to outsource that level of military activity, where it's a way to kind of create the illusion of a barrier, particularly on the international stage, where if that company, you're using it to achieve foreign policy aims in another conflict, it's very easy to go, well, that's not me, it's a private entity.
Do we have any other historical examples of PMCs being very effective in combat? Do you have any, off the top of your head, do you have any examples of PMCs changing the outcome of a battle or a conflict?
Hmm. I'm not sure there are any examples where I could really point to and say, yes, they had a distinct effect on the outcome of the conflict and they directly contributed to winning. I think probably the closest would be executive outcomes. But at the same time, when you have a PMC, there's going to be a track record where it's impossible to, I guess, have a successful outcome. And it's also very sensitive, where particularly when casualties and human rights violations are involved, that creates a very delicate idea of success.
For the general audience to define a PMC or to explain a PMC, do you think we have covered everything? Do you have something to add?
I think it might be important to note the profit model of it and the relevance that corporate stakeholders have, where the theory that drives the idea of PMCs as an effective actor is that as they are answerable to stakeholders, they have an incentive to adhere to certain norms of behavior and also to deliver certain results. That being said, when it comes to something like executive outcomes, there was ambiguity between stakeholders and the actual leaders of the company, where it's really who is answerable to who. So that is a key thing to consider is that the idea of them being revenue driven is important, but it's not a blanket model.
So, to wrap that portion of the video up, how do you think PMCs change the conduct of warfare? Do they make it more violent? Do they make it safer? Do they make it more technological, more complex? What effect do they have on warfare in general? It doesn't have to be a huge thing, but whatever effect that they have on warfare, I'm asking your opinion on it.
I would absolutely not say that they've made warfare safer. While modern militaries suffer from conduct issues and have been responsible for some pretty severe war crimes, that does not mean PMCs are the answer. I would say in some ways it is very dangerous and that you're outsourcing the monopoly of violence that is very key to state power. You're contributing to the development of a group of people with combat experience. And you have formal demobilization reintegration techniques where the idea as a PMC, particularly in the US context, based on what I know of our healthcare system, do you have the tools necessary to be able to reintegrate and demobilize these people? I would be very skeptical of that. Alongside that, you also have the idea that they are a private entity. Well, not the idea, they are a private entity, regardless of their connection to the government. On the ground, they count as a private entity. So alongside that, you have more ambiguity when it comes to monitoring their conduct. Who are they when they are in a conflict? They are not a state entity. That automatically gives them a level of gray area comparable to paramilitaries. And paramilitaries themselves have been linked to more severe violence in wars because that ambiguity lends itself to, I guess, committing violence for terror's sake. Where in the Balkan Wars, you have pretty severe war crimes being committed.
Could technically PMCs be defined as paramilitaries? What's the, maybe I should have asked this way sooner, but what is the difference between a paramilitary and a PMC?
So this is where it gets very complicated, and that none of these terms are necessarily exclusive to one another. When it comes to paramilitaries, the key is a state alignment. They are working for or alongside a state. That is the key. PMC is not necessarily. They have, and they can be hired by insurgent groups. I would also say PMCs, there is a distinctive financial benefit motivation to it, just as part of being a corporation.
You would expect other reasons for fighting for paramilitaries, right? They would have other motivations, such as they're maybe, or they think they're protecting their country. They have other interests in the war being conducted. Am I getting the idea right?
Yes, because their problem with paramilitaries, as with PMCs, is the lack of transparency. They also exist on a spectrum similar to PMCs, where you have the more low level, like to go back to the Balkan War example, where you have people joining because they want to rape, loot, and pillage, where there's an economic gain there because they're able to loot, and there are a number of people who profit definitively from that. There are also people joining for violence's sake. And then you also have alongside that the idea of like patriotism and also just very extreme nationalistic leanings, where that is a motivating factor. But there's also overlap between the two. So it gets very complicated. You also have varying levels of professionalization.
So it's very complex, and it's not just a complex for two master's level students or master's level graduates. I'm believing it's also complex legally. It might be a nightmare for a lot of legal scholars and attorneys to define these roles and to maybe to prosecute these roles. Is there a lot of struggle in these areas to define and prosecute or maybe really grasp the reality of the PMCs?
Yes, and part of this, it overlaps between PMCs and paramilitaries, is that in terms of ambiguity, you need a definitive chain of command typically to prosecute individuals. That's how it is under international law. That's how it is in domestic contexts usually. And when you have something a paramilitary or a PMC that's been hired for more covert activities, it's very hard to get that information. Governments also have an enormous incentive to either destroy it or hide it. And that was a particular problem in the Yugoslav context. Whereas with the ICTY, the term paramilitaries is used throughout court proceedings, but there was no formal legal definition given. And similar to PMCs, they are not technically under the mercenary label, whereas mercenaries are generally explicitly prohibited in fights, but PMCs are not considered them.
Then again, we have the problem of loyalty. We don't know who these people are. We don't know typically who they are loyal to. It's not mandatory for them to be loyal to one cause or one side or one employer, really. Are you personally aware of any examples where PMCs or a group within a PMC changed sides?
I know there has to be an example, but I'm not able to bring one up off the top of my head. Although, actually, I feel like you could bring up the Wagner group, maybe, with the March to Moscow. That could be a good example.
An important thing is this is an armed group mainly after financial profit, but then again, they're inherently unpredictable. Would that be a correct assumption or observation?
Yes, where you can market it however you want, there is the involvement in conflicts, and that creates very difficult security implications.
So, when we decided to make that video, I promised Kay that I would contribute or I would support her with the example of a Turkish PMC. We don't only have one. It's a booming business apparently, but a lot of them are connected to each other. But we have a very famous PMC in Turkey. It's famous for a variety of reasons. And I promised Kia that this would be my contribution. There is a book about the topic called Gölge Ordu, written by Ersin Eroğlu and Caner Taşpınar. It can be translated as the Shadow Army. It sounds very cool, but the book largely neglects the whole military, technical security studies side of the debate that we touched upon for the past 30, 40 minutes. In the Turkish context, PMCs didn't really used to be a thing up until very recently. We had a lot of experience as a country with paramilitaries, a variety of them, and there were a variety of types of paramilitaries. And throughout the Ottoman Turkish history, we had different types of warfare. So mercenaries was a huge part of Ottoman warfare as well. But if we are differentiating PMCs from that, the Republic of Turkey in itself, as far as I'm aware, had no real experience with PMCs up until 10 years ago, 10, 13 years ago. And the first PMC in a modern sense that was built off of I believe the American model, because that's what they thought, that they thought such companies exist elsewhere, so we should build something similar to them so we can have more field of movement when it comes to security initiatives. And the company that was founded is called Sadat. Funnily enough, it has been a topic of debate, a very heated debate for the past 3, 5 years. During the elections in 2023, the general elections, Sadat was one of the main topics of debate, and it unsurprisingly led to nowhere. The Turkish society is great at having very heated discussions and forgetting all about them in 2 weeks. But it used to be a huge thing a few years back. And the book I just mentioned was published in 2022 by two journalists. It's a work of journalism primarily. But Sadat is a private military company that was founded in 2012 by Adnan Tanrıverdi. Adnan Tanrıverdi is a retired, technically sacked general. He is known to be extremely conservative, and he is known to have colluded with Tayyip Erdoğan, who is the current president, from back when he was just the mayor of Istanbul in the 1990s, after 1994, where Adnan Tanrıverdi was also stationed, as far as I remember. So their friendship goes way back. But before moving on, I want to ask Kia if she has any idea about Sadat or the if she has any idea how the Turkish example fits into the larger context.
So granted, my understanding of the Turkish context is a bit more superficial, but what sets Sadat apart and what's very interesting is the ideological component, where that is very different, and that comes with certain implications that, particularly in its allegations in training terrorists.
So, Sadat is a very, very interesting example. One of its missions is on a superficial level, on a base level. Why they were founded is quite simply why any other PMC was founded. It was for financial gain. It was to also empower Turkey in foreign areas that Turkey couldn't use its military in. So it would give Turkey more leeway and more freedom of movement in international security initiatives, as I said. This was one of the base reasons. But also, their founding statement or their registration within the official offices, commerce offices in Turkey, state that they are able to, or they are registering to be able to train combatants within Turkey and outside Turkey. So it's not just they work outside Turkey, they can also have training camps in Turkey, which was also a huge heated debate back in 2022 when a leader of a political party on a television interview said an unknown group is training paramilitaries and mercenaries right in the heart of the country, which was, as far as we know today, by documentary evidence, which was correct. But we don't know who these people were and what they are trained for. So there's that. But also, Sadat's founding statement states or includes that they aim to work towards a united Islamic army. And so that would be a part of that, potentially a integral part of that Islamic army. They also have a project called Africa, which they combine Asia and Africa. And what they mean with that is there are a certain number of Muslim countries in Asia and Africa, and they are looking to work towards unifying those countries. To what end and in what scale, I have no idea. But they would be potentially or intendedly working towards uniting these countries into one single military power. So the Islamic world, in their opinion or in their eyes, would have its own superpower, military superpower. What a private military company could achieve in building a 28 country large superpower, international superpower, I have no idea, but their mission statement has that intention. So my question to Kie would be, do you, as she also previously stated, do you typically see this kind of strong ideological, let's call it ideological and not religious, do you typically see this kind of ideological leaning in a private military company? Do they operate with such rigor and with such high ideological aims? Is there another example?
No, it's quite unusual in that most PMCs market themselves essentially akin to corporations, whereas we provide this service, we are professionals. They do specifically avoid the term mercenary when describing what they do because of its connotations. But the idea of an ideological motivation and how public it is very different. And it remains to be seen what the full impact will be.
Would you say there is a conflict between the idea of a corporate army and such ideological leanings? For example, if any employer or any customer that doesn't fit into their ideological framework wanted to hire them, would they just refuse? Would that be a common reason for a PMC to refuse service?
I mean, I think it would be very uncommon where that my understanding is that based on their ideology, they would deny customer service if the customer did not fit with their broader objectives. And obviously, like, PMCs can turn down contracts, particularly if the environment is not something they feel they can fulfill a mission in or for any other reasons. But the idea would then be based on risk, maybe even ethics, and also just in terms of preserving stakeholder happiness. That would not be the case here, is my understanding.
The stakeholders and the founders of the company were all very pro Erdogan, and they came from a certain background, a political and cultural background. So even in the foundation of the company, the ideological framework was very evident. So it's a very interesting example. Would you, not that being a PMC is something that anybody should strive towards, but based on what we have discussed so far, would you feel comfortable calling these people a PMC? Or by definition, if their ideological priorities overshadow their financial priorities, what does that mean really for the essence of the company or how they function?
Well, by a textbook definition, I would say that there is a conflict where maybe they don't quite fit into the definition. But then the question becomes, what would you define them as?
They also work in different regions where Turkey also is interested in, such as Africa. And as far as we're aware, the Syrian paramilitaries that gained the country back at the end of last year, some of them were trained by Sadat. It makes sense that some of them were trained by Sadat because the PMC or whatever Sadat is, they are very effective in, or they work in every region that Turkey is interested in. So they have very close ties with other paramilitary groups or other armed combatant groups. So we also have this. Are you also aware of any other implications about Sadat or the Turkish PMC examples?
Yes. Where my understanding is that it has been a major issue with Israel, particularly if they are training paramilitaries that are in opposition to Israel in any conflict or in the region. Whereas Sadat's activities, particularly if they're ideological, they won't take place in a vacuum. There will always be a response, and there has been a response, I believe, towards it, where it has been an issue in Israeli-Turkish relations.
So that has to be researched further, but as with all other military or military adjacent things in Turkey, there's a lot of ambiguity. Everything's very vague and not very transparent. Even the basic command structure of Turkish army isn't very transparent. If you are a non-expert and if you don't speak Turkish, it's very difficult to get a hold of what the Turkish command structure looks like, which after the 2016 coup attempt, even the most basic Turkish citizen isn't aware of what the Turkish command structure looks like. We just know the military it now belongs to the regime and it now answers to Tayyip Erdogan. And this is the most basic fact that any Turkish citizen needs. So this is the Turkish context. Could we say this is a very unique example because Sadat is also called the Turkish Wagner? Would you really say there is a parallel between them, or would you say Sadat is its own unique example?
I would say it is its more unique example because even with comparisons to Wagner, calling it the Turkish Wagner, people have noted that the primary difference is ideology, where that has a definitive effect on the operations they undertake and also their conduct.
So this is the Turkish example of a PMC, which is it's very Turkish to have a very unique example that doesn't really fit in to the larger narrative. That's what we usually do. That's what Turkey usually does with anything really. So to wrap it up, one final broad question. I asked something similar a few minutes back, but to clarify further, would you say PMCs are more prone to war crimes? Would you say PMCs are less likely to be held accountable for any war crimes or human rights violations? Would you say PMCs make the world safer or more dangerous in a very simplistic sense?
I would say that they do make the world dangerous, where I'm not necessarily a fan of blanket criticism in that I think it takes away from the nuances of studying it, which I think is absolutely important and we should look more in depth into them. But my concern is that it represents the privatization of military force, and that is a realm of the state. And in conflicts where there is no state control, we have seen how quickly that devolves and how quickly the violence itself becomes self-sustaining. And my concern is the relation of PMCs to that, where you can make the argument that as a corporate entity, there are profits, and that particularly for those in the US or in other Western democracies, they will be held accountable either maybe politically or legally. But in reality, will that be the case? I don't actually know. Whereas it requires the ability to monitor the conflict, but it also requires, and as scholars have noticed, a more tangible legal proceeding for how to hold these organizations accountable, whereas how to define them. Because they don't fit under the mercenary category exactly, it presents complications in prosecution. So without a more base legal definition and legal proceedings for how to deal with when things go really wrong, I would say that they do make the world a bit more dangerous. To simplify, I think it's the same thing as with paramilitaries, where when you remove a direct chain of command and oversight, particularly the theory that militaries and democracies are beholden to the public, I think that automatically creates a space for gray area in conduct. And particularly when that happens, you see things like war crimes.
Could we also talk about sources a bit? If people are interested in reading about PMCs, where should they look? Both on a book level source and a article level sources. Where should they look?
So the two books I found particularly helpful were Mercenaries, A Guide to Private Armies and Private Military Companies by Alan Axelrod, published in 2013, and then State Control Over Private Military and Security Companies in Armed Conflict by Hannah Tonkin in 2011. And then two articles I found particularly helpful were Profiteers in Misery, Aggression, the Leadership Clause, and Private Military and Security Companies by Jeremy Pizzi, published in 2023. And also Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military Industry and Its Ramifications for International Security, published in 2001 by P.W. Singer. And then also The Wagner Group by Thomas Dorfler about PMC state relations and Russian foreign policy.
Perfect. TA sent some of these books and articles to me. I found the PZ one extremely enlightening, at least the first 10 pages of it, because the last 30 pages of it is extremely technical and legal. So it's very easy to get lost in if you're not familiar with the legal terms and if you're not a lawyer. If you're just a lowly historian, you might get lost in the terms and ambiguity of the language. But it was extremely helpful in defining PMCs in the most basic sense. But I always gravitate towards Peter Singer's Corporate Warriors, not least because I love the term corporate warriors, but also it's very accessible. And as far as I know, it's one of the first books on PMCs. Before we say goodbye to Kay, I want to ask her, do I remember correctly if I say your thesis was on Hiroshima?
Yes, that's correct. Quite a big stretch from PMCs.
But you did do a lot of security studies work during our program too, right? Because I remember you presenting on a lot of modern issues as well.
Yes, I have focused on more irregular forces, like with the Chechen Wars and also paramilitaries in the Balkan Wars.
So, if you had fun recording this, you are always more than welcome to be back to talk about Hiroshima, World War II, or the Chechen Wars, or the paramilitaries, whatever topic you like, because security studies and World War II will be a recurring theme for the channel. We haven't really started talking about it, but we will, both in the Turkish context and also in a larger sense. World War II will be a prominent theme on history after all. So if you want to talk about it, if you want to talk about your thesis, you are always welcome. Many, many thanks to Kay for being here, for accompanying me, and for enlightening us with a lot of information that I'm sure a lot of our viewers weren't really familiar with. So I do believe this is one of the more unique videos that we made. It was a great time to have Kay on here. I'm only hoping she had fun as well.
I did. Thank you very much for having me. I hope I was a bit of help.
It was for me. I'm hoping it was for anybody who watches. So many thanks for watching and many thanks to Kay for being here with us. We will see you in the next video in English and take care.